He said the first killing was an accident. They always say that, but accidents don't come with notebooks, and they don't come with 7 graves. The strangest part wasn't the bodies. It wasn't the confession. It was the detail he knew that we never released. He wasn't panicking. He wasn't breaking. He was guiding, like a teacher watching students struggle through a problem he already knew the answer to. Late February, northern Minnesota. The kind of cold that doesn't bite. It settles. It sinks into metal, into bone, into the quiet between sounds. Out there, silence isn't empty. It has weight. Lakes don't freeze evenly up north. They remember movement. They remember weight. They crack in the places where someone tried to pretend they didn't. Blackwater was one of those lakes, the kind locals avoided after dark, not because of superstition, but because things had gone missing there before. We found the first body under the ice, 20 feet from shore. A deer hunter noticed a dark shape frozen beneath the surface, too symmetrical to be debris. Not a log, not weeds, not a shadow. Just a person, trapped in place like the lake had decided to keep him. When we cut through and brought him up, he didn't fight the air, didn't gasp, didn't move. He looked almost peaceful. That alone told me something had gone wrong long before the water, except for the details you can't ignore. His hands were bound behind his back with copper wire, thick gauge, twisted tight. The kind you don't use unless you expect resistance. The kind that digs into skin and doesn't give. His eyes were open, frozen that way, as if the last thing he saw was something he never got to understand. His name was Marcus Hale, 42, mechanic, divorced, quiet life. He fixed snowmobiles, outboard motors, old pickups that should have died years ago. No criminal record, no financial trouble, no open disputes, and no missing person report. No one had been looking for him. That absence bothered me more than the body. People don't disappear cleanly. Someone always notices a pattern breaking, a job missed, a dog left alone, a phone that goes quiet. Marcus had simply slipped. At the morgue, we cataloged everything: clothing, wallet, keys, and inside his boot we found a folded note, pressed flat and protected from water like it had been placed there on purpose. One line, handwritten: "I know what you did at Blackwater." Blackwater wasn't a town. It wasn't even a place most people could point to. It was a logging road that went nowhere, ending at an abandoned mill swallowed by trees. A structure left behind when the industry moved on, leaving only rot and rust and a smell like wet wood. We'd been there before. 2 years earlier, a 19-year-old student vanished at that same location. Chloe Bennett, art major, visiting home for winter break. Her car was found at the trailhead, keys still in the ignition, radio low, like she'd planned to be back in 5 minutes. On the passenger seat sat her sketchbook, open. Inside was a charcoal drawing of the mill's broken windows, drawn close enough to suggest she'd been standing just feet away. No struggle, no blood, no witnesses. 5 days of searching turned up nothing. The case went cold the way cold cases always do. Not with closure, but with exhaustion. Flyers peel. People stop calling. Leads dry into dust, until Marcus surfaced under the ice with that note in his boot. We reviewed older missing person files again. Different years, different victims. But each of them had been within a mile of Blackwater in the weeks before they vanished. Not together, just near it. We reopened the file and returned to Blackwater. Same road, same trees, same silence pressing in from all sides. The mill stood there like a bad memory someone refused to bury. And we met the same man, Walter Kincaid, 58, retired forester. He lived alone in a trailer just off the road, far enough to be private, close enough to notice movement. He had stacks of split firewood that looked too neat to belong to a lonely life. Tools arranged, yard clean. The kind of order that doesn't happen by accident. He'd been helpful the first time, brought supplies, joined search lines, pointed out trails. Always calm, always cooperative. Men like that are dangerous, not because they hide, but because they belong. We brought him in for questioning. Routine. No cuffs. No raised voices. He sat across from us with his hands folded, back straight, eyes steady. No tapping fingers, no shaking knee. He denied knowing Marcus, denied any involvement in Chloe's disappearance, denied being at the mill the day Chloe vanished, even though we had statements that he'd helped coordinate volunteers. Then, casually, like he was correcting a typo, he leaned forward. "You're looking in the wrong year," he said. The room went quiet. That detail hadn't been released. Not publicly, not privately. Even among us, it wasn't a year question. Chloe vanished 2 winters ago. That was the file. That was the truth. Or so we thought. We kept him talking. And that's when it happened. The subtle shift from questioning a witness to listening to a man narrate. He corrected dates, mentioned snowfall totals from that week, how the plows were behind, how the banks were higher near the bend in the road. He recalled generator noise at the mill, the specific kind of metal rattle it made when it struggled under load. Then he referenced details from the original crime scene photos. Angles, distances, positions. Photos he had never been shown. He described the sketchbook on the passenger seat and said, without being asked, it was open to the mill drawing. She shaded the left window darker, probably because the sun was hitting it. That wasn't in the public report. I watched him while he spoke. He wasn't searching for words. He was choosing them. After 6 hours, we ended the interview. For the first time in my career, I wasn't wondering if we had our suspect. I was wondering how long he'd been preparing. Back at the office, we pulled every record we could. Old call logs, volunteer sign-in sheets, search team maps, tips we'd dismissed because they sounded like nothing. A pattern started to appear. Not in what Walter did, but in where he always seemed to be. Close enough to know, close enough to influence. Always in the orbit of the investigation. Like a moth circling a porch light. We obtained a warrant that night. It wasn't dramatic. No SWAT, no shouting, just paperwork, headlights on snow, and that feeling in your gut when you know you're about to see something you won't unsee. Behind his trailer, we found disturbed ground. Not fresh, careful, intentional. White stones placed deliberately. Not to mark graves, but to remember locations. Like he'd wanted a map only he could read. We dug until our arms went numb and the cold became an afterthought. 7 bodies, including Chloe. Some were wrapped, some weren't. Different stages of decay. Different years, different seasons. The Earth told its own timeline. The forensic evidence spoke clearly. Tool marks matched equipment in his workshop. Fibers matched his clothing. Copper wire traced back to a purchase years earlier. Old hardware receipts saved in a folder, because he saved everything. But the case truly ended when we opened the locked cabinet in his bedroom. Inside were notebooks. Dozens. Each page held dates, times, routes, weather notes, names. Not victims, targets. People he'd followed, observed, memorized. Waitresses, construction workers, a substitute teacher, a man who jogged the same loop every morning. Some entries were crossed out, others circled. Beside a few were notes. Too public. Came home early. Not ready yet. Has a dog. Always parks under light. He hadn't been killing randomly. He'd been practicing restraint. That was the part that chilled me more than the bodies. Not impulse, not rage, patience. Walter Kincaid confessed 2 days later. No lawyer, no bargaining. He asked for coffee, drank it slowly. Then he started talking like he'd been waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions. He said the first killing was an accident. They always say that. The first time was different, he said quietly. I didn't mean for her to see me. He said he panicked, that he only meant to scare someone, only meant to teach them a lesson, only meant... He stopped himself and smiled like he'd caught a lie escaping too early. Then he told us something I still hear sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet room. He said fear made him feel visible, that without it, he disappeared. When someone finally sees you, he said, you don't forget it. When asked why he kept the notebooks, why he documented everything so carefully, he said, because someday someone would read them. Not might, not could, would. As if discovery was part of the design. As if the investigation was another audience. He even corrected us again during the confession. Small things, like a man polishing his own story. No, he said once when we mentioned the lake. It wasn't Wednesday. It was Tuesday. The wind was different on Wednesday. And he was right. He knew because he had been there. Because he'd stood on that ice, listening to it creak under weight. And he remembered the sound like music. He was sentenced to life without parole. The families buried their dead. The mill was scheduled for demolition. Officially, the case was closed. But one detail never left me. Inside the final notebook, the last page was blank. No names, no dates. Just a single sentence. You never catch monsters by what they hide. You catch them by what they're willing to show. Because the truth is, he didn't look like a monster. He looked like a neighbor, a volunteer, a man holding a thermos at a search party. He didn't hide from the search. He stood in it. He carried supplies. He gave directions. He asked if anyone had found her yet. Evil doesn't always run. Sometimes it waits for you to trust it. This is Last Trace, and some answers come too late to make you feel safe again.